Let's turn our attention to the United States. Simon Jackman is CEO at the US Study Centre. He joins me now. I'm going to turn away from the vaccine rollout for a moment and look to the public spending initiatives from Joe Biden, including on infrastructure. It's audacious. It's massive, isn't it?
Yeah, it's interesting, Kieran. The bill that they did get through is considered just emergency spending to get the economy back on its feet after COVID. What they're talking about is way more to come with infrastructure and a whole lot more coming in behind it. It's perhaps one of the more radical sort of expansions of the U.S. domestic spending we've seen proposed in a long, long time. And of course, the politics immediately get very tricky, given the precarious sort of state of the U.S. Congress and the Senate, perhaps in particular, 50-50 Senate, of course. But there shouldn't be any, I think, sort of underestimating the ambitiousness of what Joe Biden is proposing. And of course, for those of us that have spent time in the United States in the last couple of years, infrastructure, you've only got to drive from New York Airport, say, into New York City or any major U.S. city to understand infrastructure is something that the United States is desperately crying out for. And every president comes off as talking big on infrastructure. I think Biden is perhaps using the COVID crisis in particular to shine a big, bright light on let's get America sort of fixed, as it were, not just in public health, but it's the state of its public infrastructure as well.
What about the state of the democracy? There's a lot of bills. I know in Georgia there's certainly been efforts on voting rights and restricting voting, and therefore making it not as easy necessarily to vote. And some corporations, quite a few CEOs in fact, are talking about donation boycotts to the Republicans as a result.
Yeah, this is a really interesting development, Kieran. In the wake of the 2020 election, where Biden won narrowly a number of heretofore so-called red states, state legislatures frustrated that the courts sort of didn't come to the rescue, as it were, and rule in favour of more restrictive access to the polls. They've tightened up their own laws on the books about how to vote, the mechanics of voting. Things that we take for granted here in Australia, like early voting, voting by mail, the number of polling places, things like that. Republican-controlled legislatures, particularly across the southern United States, Georgia, you mentioned in particular, have a state that Biden won very, very narrowly, have put these proposing laws to really tighten up ballot access. And as you mentioned, Kieran, roughly about 100 CEOs apparently had a conference call this weekend. Yeah. And we're talking blue chip America, Kieran. We're talking everything from Major League Baseball right through to the airlines, saying, well, look, this is unacceptable. A lot of their workforces are diverse workforces, and this legislation really does have the consequence of targeting minority voters. And so there's an awful lot of backlash, and it just highlights, I think, some of the dire sort of politics that are confronting the Republican Party at the moment. The idea that the only way they can win is by restricting the access of certain sorts of voters to the polls. And again, Kieran, the contrast for Australian voters is remarkable. Here we are, where both sides of politics enthusiastically endorse a regime of compulsory voting and all that goes with it, making access to the polls quite easy in Australia. It really does mess with your head, so to speak, when you think about that being such a core tenet of one part of conservative politics in America.